Good evening. My name is Ron Thibodeau. I too am an associate editor here at the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. When I started college at LSU in the mid-1970s, I was assigned a room in the men's dormitory that was built into the football stadium. I was impressed. I thought this was very cool, living in Tiger Stadium. All right. So Mom and Dad moved me up to campus, and to my mom's horror, the place was a dump. So much so that my dad confided to me years later that Mom cried all the way home. An hour and 45 minutes back to Bayou Country. Not that I minded the conditions. I didn't even notice. I was just excited to be on campus as an LSU student. I didn't know it at the time, but 20-some years earlier, that football stadium dormitory, those very halls, one of those rooms, became home to a young man from New Orleans who came to LSU seeking an education and ended up rewriting the university's history. A.P. Tureaud Jr. was the first, and for a time, the only African-American undergraduate at LSU. He landed there after agreeing to serve as a plaintiff in a lawsuit filed by his father, the legendary civil rights advocate A.P. Tureaud Sr. His student experience was fraught with difficulties, from ostracism to harassment, and not just from the white student body, but from faculty members as well. On top of that, as he worked to keep up with his studies, attorneys for the state were back and forth to court trying to get him dismissed from the university. Many years later, after a distinguished career as an educator in New York, Washington, and New Orleans, he teamed up with Dr. Rachel Emanuel, Director of Communications and Development for Southern University Law Center, and a noted documentary filmmaker. Together, they wrote his father's biography titled A More Noble Cause, A.P. Tureaud and the Struggle for Civil Rights in Louisiana. Their work was supported by a grant from the LEH, and the book was published in April 2011 by, I am pleased to note, the Louisiana State University Press. Dr. Emanuel and Mr. Tureaud tell the story of his challenging experience as an LSU student in chapter 12 of the book. An excerpt from that account appears as a feature story in the new issue of Louisiana Cultural Vistas. Tonight, I am happy to introduce to you Dr. Rachel Emanuel and A.P. Tureaud Jr.
Thank you very much. I have to say thank you very much for the assistance I've been provided by the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities to pursue my research and goals in documentary filmmaking and this book. Because of you, my work is providing the A.P. Tureaud story to various audiences all over, and my goals are being accomplished. This evening's audience, I thank you for your interest. And let me tell you that I will be brief in what I share because I want to give most of our time to our presentation from the living history, A.P. Tureaud Jr. But let me just answer 3 questions that I usually get asked when I am, thank you, when I am going all over talking about A.P. Tureaud. First, they asked, why were you interested in doing this? And I often do what you're not supposed to do, is answer a question with the question. But I ask them, have you ever found out some information or heard about a person or a story that was so inspiring and so intriguing that you wanted to tell everybody that would listen to you? Well, that is what my journey of the last 25 years has been with the AP Tureaud story. Also, I asked the audience this question, and I'll do this tonight. When you think of the civil rights history, the civil rights movement in the United States during the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, what states do you think about?
Mississippi, Alabama.
And yes, those are the states. And even for Louisiana audiences, we never hear Louisiana. And so having found out about AP Tureaud, when I was researching the first students to attend, African American students to attend LSU, when I was working there in 1988, and we were planning a first time reunion of black students, I looked in the PR files and I found the stories about the first students in 50, 51, 52, 53. And I kept seeing this name, AP Tureaud, attorney, civil rights activist, who represented all of these students. And I realized that this was a very significant person in the history of civil rights in this country. And I thought, you know, what a legacy that he left for this institution, that I was able to go to school, and then I was even working in the PR office at that time because of the work that he did and the legacy that he left. And so that reunion in 1988 allowed me to be introduced to AP Tureaud Jr. And boy, what a relationship it has been since that time. He has become the symbol for reconciliation at LSU with what he experienced and then what he has given back to us. And I tell people that the legacy of AP Tureaud, anybody who attended LSU after 1950, when the first African-American student, a law student, Roy Wilson, was admitted because of AP Tureaud Sr.'s lawsuit, is part of the legacy of AP Tureaud, because he left a desegregated university where African Americans could attend. And my daughter, who's in the audience, Lauren, was 3 years old when we did that reunion. And when I was preparing notes for tonight and realized that it has been a 25-year journey, we had a reunion 2 weeks ago where we celebrated the legacy of AP Tureaud, and my grandson is 3 years old. So during this time, I have been able to tell the story because of all the things that people have provided to me in my journey, and that is my teachers, my college professors, who say that I'm just the model student, because when I did my master's thesis about how AP Tureaud was covered by the Louisiana Weekly during the 4 years that he was desegregating LSU and was president of the New Orleans NAACP chapter, I was able to look at his work at the Amistad Research Center. And so that was a source of, he had his papers there, and he helped tell this story. But along the way, the journey has been meeting people like you, and everywhere we go to do a book talk, there's someone that gives me an A.P. Tureaud story, and I get to know that his life has been embodied in this community and in this state for what he has done. I will stop now and tell you that while AP is speaking, I will use a PowerPoint that we used during the Here's to You, Mr. Tureaud production 2 Fridays ago at the Manship Theater, where the gospel choir was on stage the whole time, and we went through the 6 decades of Black students at LSU and who were the first, and just carrying forth the legacy of A.P. Tureaud and celebrating the fact that if it were not for someone as courageous as A.P. Tureaud Jr., we wouldn't be where we are today. And we celebrate our challenges, we celebrate our victories, and we celebrate the diversity and the inclusion that now continues to be fought for at institutions like LSU, in communities like New Orleans and Louisiana and Shreveport, where I'm from, and the United States of America. As we just celebrated 50 years of the March on Washington, and next year we'll be celebrating 50 years of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. All of this work in Louisiana, we owe a debt of gratitude to men like A.P. Tureaud Sr., and then his legacy of his son, A.P. Tureaud Jr. Thank you so much.
Well, it's been a long night, so I won't take too much time. I need to move around and see people. I don't like standing behind things. First, I want to thank the LEH for featuring the book, how much it means to us, and what it means to the civil rights movement, and what it means in today's society, because we see things happening that we realize things have not changed a whole lot in many areas, and we need to continue the work that our parents did, and our friends did, and so many other organizations and people did. There's so much that I would like to share with you, but I think if you read the excerpts in the journal and read the book, you'll get a sense of the global experiences that occurred in Louisiana, many of which were always collaborations with everyone that would work with the people who were interested in eliminating segregation. My dad was a man of very simple taste. He would be quite astounded that people are paying this much attention to his work. He knew that he was doing important work, but he preferred to stay in the background and use the courts as a way to achieve desegregation. And his goal was integration. He didn't just want to do away with segregation. He grew up as a poor boy in the Marigny, just below the French Quarter. He fraternized with Italians and South Americans and Central Americans in the French market. He was part of a Creole culture. His parents, his brothers, his relatives were all skilled laborers. And he made himself into a professional man by leaving New Orleans at 18 on his own, alone, never been out of the state, seeking a high school education because there was not a high school here that he could go to for blacks in that time. My father was born in 1899. We grew up in the 7th Ward. I'm one of 6 children. We all went to black schools. Lena C. Jones, Clark High School, Xavier University. Now, I'd like to get the record straight. I say this every time I speak, that I was not recruited by my father to be a test case. I volunteered to go to LSU. I thought I would have a great experience there. One reason I went to LSU was because it was a good place for the money. It was a good school. I'm one of 6 children. One sister was at Xavier. I was second in line. My father never earned a lot of money because that wasn't his focus in life. We lived comfortably and we had all of the resources that we wanted and needed. We traveled, we all were well educated. But his goal was not to have a lot of money. People come up to me today and say, my grandfather, your father did legal work for him and he didn't charge him anything, or he charged him a small amount of money. We used to get cars given to us as payment, pawn tickets. One time we got a pig and lots of food because my father roamed all over the state helping people, and I used to go with him. And many times I would go with him because I was the only boy, but also to keep him awake. Because he drove all over and he drove alone. And my father would buy the cheapest, most stripped down blackboard. The only thing he had in the car was a radio. And it was always attuned to the news. And it rattled and shaked. The doors rattled. And I remember once we were going to Pasquistan for summer holiday, and he had 3 flats going to Pasquistan, Mississippi. But that was the way he was, very easygoing, simple man. My experiences at LSU were part of a continuum of being a magnet for segregation. I was always seemed to be in a place where people were telling me, you cannot do this, you cannot go there, you cannot try on clothes. It seemed to me that I was always attracting that kind of negative response from people, whether it was here or in Washington, D.C., or in New York, or in a church in Baltimore, or in Pasquistan, Mississippi. And one thing that I wanted to do was to live a life where I could be an average American young man. And I thought going to LSU would give me an opportunity to really be a part of an integrated world. So I decided to go to LSU from Clark High School, which is still there off of Esplanade Avenue. And people were astounded that I made that decision. And at first they thought I was being a comedian. Like, well, why, your guidance counselor, what do you mean LSU is your first choice? You can't go there. And I remember my guidance counselor, who was also my English teacher and football coach, Mr. Blakely, said to me, is this a joke? And I said, no, it's not a joke. Well, you know you can't go there. It's not integrated. You have to go to Southern or Grambling. And I said, look, my dad said I could go there. I can go there. And that's the way we lived. If he said you could do something, or his colleagues said you could do something, we did it. And we believed that we could. And he didn't do any of these things by himself. He recruited, he co-opted, he worked with everyone. The black community and the white community, wherever he was. So that LSU did not seem like a stretch. It just seemed like a part of what was normal. I mean, I knew it was going to be an issue for about a few days, but I thought, well, they'll get over it and everything will be fine. And Ron, where's Ron? I want to just tell you, living in that dormitory was a hell of a nightmare for me. That was the worst part of the whole experience. I can't tell you all the details because it would take too long, but I didn't realize when I agreed to go to LSU that I was going to be in the Air Force or Army ROTC. I didn't go to college to be in the armed services, but those universities had contracts with the federal government, and you had to be in ROTC. And I chose the Air Force thinking it would be easier than the Army. They were all ridiculous because I had cadet squad leaders who were just ordinary students who thought they were generals and sergeants. And I realized once I got there that I was going to have a very difficult time after the first day. Because the whole idea, I was a symbol of something that the university, the state, and the country was not willing to recognize in 1953, which was 60 years ago. I'm 77 years old. I was 17 at the time that this started, and it was before, as an undergraduate, before Mississippi, which was James Meredith, and Arthur Reed Lucy, which was Alabama. Louisiana was always ahead of the curve. When you look at the history of civil rights activities, you look at Plessy Ferguson, you look at the Citizens Committee, you look at a lot of things that were going on in the country, antebellum era, post-Civil War era, Louisiana was ahead of the curve for many reasons. The French culture, the Spanish culture, the Latin American culture, the Haitian culture. So being a part of a mixed environment wasn't my problem, it was their problem. And living in that stadium, which was not as big as it was when you got there, they kept adding on to it. It was fairly modest, it was 3 floors, and it was a complete oval. And they put me on the 3rd floor, so I could walk up more steps. They put me also in a room for 3. I thought I was going to have roommates. I mean, stupid as I was, or maybe naive, I thought I would have roommates. I had a room for 3. And what they did was, there was a concerted effort to make it uncomfortable, so they put me in a room for 3 with 2 rooms on either side of me, and those guys banged on the walls. There were 3 guys in each room. They took turns keeping me up at night, banging on the walls and making noise and stuff like that, and putting crap on the doorknob, and whatever could be done was done, and that was a miserable thing. And then they were also your cadet leaders, so you had to jump to and salute them and all that kind of stuff. So that was pretty bad. One of the stories, and then I'll make this short, one of the stories that I tell often is I used to get up in the morning because I couldn't sleep at night because they would take turns trying to keep me up. I guess they figured if they wore me out, I would leave. The biggest concern I had was that I would fail. I wasn't going to pass my courses because the professors, well, they wouldn't recognize my presence. They didn't call on me, they didn't offer sessions to help, and made comments about my presence in the classroom using rather derogatory language. You know, the word Negro is not quite the N-word, but it's not Negro either. So that I was the only Negro in that class, you know, I mean, things like that. 17 years old, coming from intelligent people that you expect to be educated by, it was a shock. Because I thought everyone was there to get an education. I have since met graduates from LSU who are my age now, and of course they're all white, were telling me how, you know, I was in your class at LSU, and I sat behind you in such and such a class. And those were the good old days. And I think, are you stupid or what? The good old days for you, but not for me. And if you really had any sense of accountability, I would be ashamed to say that I was there because you didn't speak to me, or you didn't try to befriend me. And I only needed 1 or 2 friends. But I had many friends in New Orleans. I had friends in Baton Rouge. We had family friends in Baton Rouge. I could go visit them, but my job was on the campus. My job was to be a successful freshman. and I was not being a successful freshman. And the only thing that saved me was a mistrial. The lawyers worked very hard for LSU, and I think there were 19 graduates of the LSU Law School. Was it 19 or what? Was it about 19 of them? Who volunteered to work with the Attorney General, who was the lead lawyer, and a person that some of you might know from history in Louisiana, Leander Perez from Blackman Parish, who was the scourge of the earth in terms of racial segregation, and did a lot of very bad things to many, many people in the state. But he was the lawyer that led the pack when the first time and the only time that I went to court with my mother and my father, because my father was not my lawyer in the court. His one of his colleagues, Tureaud, A.M. Tureaud was the lawyer, but Leander Perez, if you read the article, called me the most ungrateful nigger in the state of Louisiana because I didn't go to Grambling or Southern. So I sat there, and at 17 I thought, is this man really saying that? And I vowed not to go back to court ever again, and I didn't. But what saved me from failure was that the case had been tried by a one-judge court, and Judge Kelly Wright, who was a local, a man from the Irish Channel in New Orleans, a rather working-class family, was the judge on that case that argued and voted for, not argued, but voted for many civil rights or made decisions about many civil rights cases, including the integration of the New Orleans public schools. He ruled that I could go to LSU until the case was finally decided, and I was admitted on a preliminary injunction. But the LSU lawyers thought that it was a constitutional issue and asked for a three-judge court and revoked the preliminary injunction that allowed me to stay there. So my father came up and said, I've got good news and bad news. And I said, well, give me the good news, because I haven't had any. And he said, I'll spend the night with you. I said, okay, that's good. What's the bad news? You have to leave. And I said, you got it backwards. The good news is I'm out of here. And we left the next day. And that case went through the courts. My dad filed almost immediately with the U.S. Supreme Court, and they reinstated the preliminary injunction. But I had made up my mind that I would not go back. And I said, the case can go on its own merit, but not me. I'm not there to be destroyed. I chose to go. I chose not to go back. And my father and mother supported that. And that next Monday, I left on Friday, the next Monday, my father had enrolled me at Xavier. And the professors at Xavier said, well, what are you doing here 8 weeks late, 55 days late? And I said, just give me a shot. I'll do my best. I don't want to sit at home for a semester. And I did, and I had the most marvelous education at Xavier, and then went on to Columbia. But that experience at LSU at 17 taught me more about human behavior than anything else I've ever experienced in my life, because it showed me the negative side of the vigilance that people have to control society in a way that is really very, very unsettling. The impact of my father's experiences at LSU, having sued them 13 times, not because he wanted to, but because the whole effort in the South was to slow down integration or desegregation. So the universities, you couldn't take the whole school and sue the whole university. They made you do graduate schools and undergraduate schools. But because of the work of graduates like Rachel and many other black graduates at LSU forming a black alumni chapter, they named a building for my father. And last year, 2 years ago, I received an honorary doctorate from LSU. Which was quite an honor, not just for me, but for all of the black men and women who could not go before 1953, that had to go somewhere else to school. And you know, a lot of people don't know the history, but when I was in college, black students who wanted to go to professional schools were offered a stipend by the state to go out of state so that you wouldn't challenge, because there weren't graduate programs in Grambling or Southern. And so to keep you from suing, because remember the law of the land was separate but equal. It wasn't equal. It was separate, but it wasn't equal. So if you wanted to go to medical school, my friends who went to medical school, they got a small stipend, not enough to pay your tuition. So there were all kinds of ways to sort of subterfuge the law. I think it's time for me to stop now. I wish you would, we are not, Rachel and I are traveling all over the country doing book talks, because people find the story fascinating, and the culture of Louisiana. I also go into all of the cultural, historical pieces of Louisiana and New Orleans, and my family coming out of a plantation and coming out of slavery and celebrating that plantation, which is in Baton Rouge, and having a book talk there. And so a lot of things that have come into the process of this book, which took us 12 years to write, really encapsulates many subplots that I did not know, that my father did not know, or his family did not know. And Lee Loomis, you want to stand up, please? Lee, stand up so they can see you. Lee is the archivist of the Archdiocese of New Orleans. And when we were writing the book, I thought, why don't I find out where I came from, who my relatives were, how did I get this name? It's a French name. Lee did the research, all in French, all over St. James Parish. She found the slave and the plantation owner, and she found out that she's also my fifth cousin. So it's been quite an interesting journey, and I can't thank you all enough for coming tonight. And I apologize to my friends who came to support me, because you've heard these stories too many times, and I thought maybe you'd had enough. But anyway, it's been a journey, and the journey is not just for me and Rachel. The journey is for all of us, because work still must be done. Thank you.
Month, and you come back home for the weekend. Your mom's not happy. Your dad is listening to you. You're not really happy. And there's some discussion that goes on. I got this from the article. There's some discussion that goes on, and you end up going back. What was that discussion? What was it?
Well, the discussion didn't happen just that weekend. You know, I was there at LSU for 55 days. It seemed like 55 years. But after the first week, I knew there would be problems for a few days. Being an optimist and a social person, I thought, well, they'll get accustomed to me, and I'll make a few friends, and gradually it will be okay. But after the first week, I realized that there was such a concerted effort to get me out. It was a silent treatment. I had a student slip a note under my door, and he said, I am from New Jersey or someplace. I'm Jewish, Italian, French, but he was everything you could imagine in terms of European mixture. I would like to be your friend. I know it's tough, but if I say one word to you or show any friendship to you, I will be blackballed. He said, maybe in 2 or 3 years it'll get better. I thought to myself, 2 or 3 years, is he crazy? I'm not saying 2 or 3 years. So every weekend, now my father had this little black Ford. They gave me their car so I could come home on the weekends. I had bought a jalopy from a policeman for $150 that hardly ran. My mother said, no, it's good. Let your father keep your car, and it'll break down on him, and he'll buy another good car. But they had my car. I would come home on the weekends, so every weekend we would talk about, well, how is it? Do you want to leave? Do you want to stay? My dad said, look, if you don't want to be there, you leave. So we had this discussion all along. The only thing I didn't, and I'll make this short, the only thing I didn't realize was that there were people who were looking for me that may not have been university people, I don't know, I found out later, who wanted to figure out a better way to get rid of me in a violent way. And I knew my parents knew that. I didn't know it. My parents were not alarmists. So they didn't share all of the other stuff that happened to our household and my father's office through all these lawsuits, Ku Klux Klan and bomb threats and all of that. We didn't live with that as children. We found about, we heard about it later and dealt with it, but my parents didn't feed us all of that negativism. So when I came home for the weekend, it was like, okay, he's here another weekend. My sisters would say, oh, we're going to turn your room into a closet, because we need the space, so they made fun of things. But our family was a regular, ordinary family, and everybody knew what was going on. But it wasn't beating your breast and pulling your hair out. It was just part of what we had to do. Yes?
I have a question. Since you were dealing with death threats and all other kind of things, I'm sure, why? Like, why did you continue to go somewhere you knew you weren't wanted?
Well, it wasn't that I went somewhere I wasn't wanted. I wasn't wanted anywhere that I wanted to be. I mean, if I went to Maison Blanche and went to buy a pair of shoes or clothing, I wasn't wanted there. They wanted the money, but they weren't going to treat me like the other customers. Where was I going to be if I didn't change something and make the world better for everybody? I grew up with an environment that you can make changes. I didn't go to LSU to be a test case. I really thought I could make it work and it would work. And then when I realized it couldn't, I didn't want to be the quitter and leave, because I knew then I had become the symbol for a movement much bigger than myself. But that was not my goal, and I did not want publicity. I mean, we didn't look for reporters and publicity and all of that, and they hounded you. They hounded you constantly. And LSU has a daily newspaper, the Daily Reveille, and it's a very nice newspaper. But every step I took was something in the paper. You have to swim the swimming pool. They had an outdoor pool then, and it was a long, narrow pool. And if you didn't pass swimming, which I think is a great idea, you had to take swimming, because swimming is a life skill. The day I was to swim the pool, and I'm a good swimmer, it was like a media event. Will they drain the pool? I swam the pool by myself. No one else would get in when I swam the pool. Now, you may say, oh, that's great. Look at all the attention he's getting. No, it's not great. When I walked in the shower in the dormitory, they didn't have partitions. There would be 6 shower heads. I'd go in, and I never went into the same one twice. If guys had soaked themselves up and they saw me coming, they would walk out and leave. So everywhere you went, when I went to a classroom, I sat in the middle. Everybody would scatter and sit as far away as possible. Now, at 17, that's not the kind of life you want. The only people who were friendly to me to LSU were the black help, the guys who cut the grass, and the women who served on the food line. I would take my tray to the dining room. By the time I ended to the end, I'd have food for 50 people. And they'd say, hey baby, you come to my house this weekend, we'll take good care of you. And I'd say, yeah, well that's great, but you know, I gotta make it here. This is where I have to make it, but I appreciate the offer. But the only people that ever spoke to me on that campus were the black help. And I used to have conversations with the guys cutting grass because nobody else would talk to me.
I'd like to say that when I asked the question about the states and the civil rights movement, I then would say that we've never been forgiven here in Louisiana for Plessy versus Ferguson. But then I can go on with the story of A.P. Tureaud, who identified with the Creole attorneys who brought that case and hoped for a different outcome. But he dedicated the rest of his entire legal career in reversing Plessy versus Ferguson.
One more question, you stop yet?
So, based on the litigation that was going on at LSU, I'm a graduate of UNO, and I went to UNO when it was LSU UNO. And LSU UNO opened as an integrated school only 5 years after your experience.
No, it wasn't 5 years. It was 1966.
1958.
No, it was 1963.
58.
58?
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I was wondering if the litigation that happened at
You're talking
LSU.
about UNO?
Yes, LSU UNO.
LSU, I know, in 58?
Yeah, it opened in 58.
I know that was my dad's case, but I thought that was much later.
So your dad did have,
Oh, yes, yes.
I wondered about that.
Yes, he did. And he and, you know, they worked together, a whole group of lawyers and so forth, but I didn't know it was 58. I thought it was much later.
I didn't know.
But it opened as the first integrated Southern
Right,
University.
exactly, yeah.
In the documentary, we had some vintage, spectacular footage with the students coming out of the courtroom, courthouse with A.P. Tureaud and Dutch Morial. And then they interviewed one of the students, and she said, you know, they were asked, the reporter was asking her, well, what do you think about this? She said, I feel good about being able to go to LSU. Then they went to one of the opposing attorneys, and he said, the NAACP, instead of using this money to bring all these lawsuits, should be giving these students money to go to school in a place that, without harassing their white neighbors and setting themselves up for ridicule and scorn. And I think that was one of the most powerful accounts from the media when we were doing Journey for Justice for A.P. Tureaud.
I'll just add one other personal thing to that. When I came down, my father was about ready to retire. He had cancer, and he was sort of half in his office, half at home. And he said, you should see how UNO has grown. This had to be, I think he died in, my father died in 73, so this had to be in the late 60s. And we lived near there, off of Division Field Avenue in the 7th Ward. So it was, he said, jump in the car, drive me. I want to just show you how big the university has become, because when it first started, it was a naval base.
Right.
And so we were driving, and a car of students came by, white kids came by, and they tried to kind of push us off the road. And he said, television and radio and newspapers, people know what I look like now. He said, and that's just a little harassment, but he said, I prefer to stay in the background and not do stuff like that because you can get more done. So he was a very self-effacing kind of guy. Thank you very much for your attention.